Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. And I really like this intersection between art, culture, and kind of the private sector and trying to reflect on climate change and sustainability. So maybe I think I'm just going to share you my screen. Here's a bit about my quickly in 2 words, my background. So I was indeed selling very expensive lipstick at some point, but like probably many of you, I was reflecting of my value on this planet. And so had the very, very fortunate possibility to meet my co-founders. And I think a lot of moments came to that switch in my life, but I came across this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that said, "Do one thing every day that scares you." And I was shocked at how complacent I was and unscary my day-to-day life was. So that was kind of the impulse of a reflection of where was I going to go and what did I want to do. Another moment, which was kind of an aha moment for me, and I don't know if you know the blog Wait But Why. He's quite famous in kind of breaking down many big questions that we have on life. And I found it quite horrific that all the weeks in one life could fit in one slide. So that also kind of pushed me to reflect, if I had to count on my day-to-day and if I had to value my work, what would it be? And if anything, it should be big. So I left a kind of perfect postcard Switzerland and went on a first world tour in 2013 to build Seedstar's world. And we came across much more chaotic realities. This is where I was living for a while in Nigeria, which is the economic capital of in Lagos, which is the economical capital of Nigeria. So as you can see, a lot of chaos, but at the same time, so much opportunity, because one thing was holding true while wherever we were going was that everyone had a profound need and value for great education, for a premium healthcare system that worked, and even for all the nice things and luxuries that ones would have in their lifetimes. The opportunity was huge to disrupt and rethink these industries and the status quo in these markets, knowing that there was unbelievable talent, but that didn't have necessarily the same access to infrastructure, talent, and of course, investment. So Seedstar's thesis really is about kind of being at that sweet spot between the rise of emerging markets, the democratization of technology and its capability to talk about impact at scale, and of course, this really global movement of entrepreneurship, and not just any entrepreneurial movement, but one which studies and so many have kind of pinpointed is one of social entrepreneurship, with a generation which has huge conscious of their capabilities to change the status quo and believing that their entrepreneurial journey is a valid career choice in their respective.
What was very powerful about this 6% is that it showcased that 6% of companies in the UK accounted for 50% of job creation. And so our reflection was, okay, how can we find and how can we target and support those 6% in emerging markets? Which means that we're actually targeting very specific enterprises, which are called high growth ventures. So many big players in the impact space, such as Omidyar Network, who kind of built this kind of high growth venture framework, have been working for many years on identifying them and classifying them. And the uniqueness of these high growth ventures and why we want to support them specifically is because the market scale potential is very high, but also the disruption in terms of innovation, either in the process or the product or service, is also quite high. And that's how you distinguish them with livelihood sustaining enterprises. So rather than for us entering the space through microfinancing, for example, we really wanted to target these high growth ventures, which in many ways are the famous startups that we have in the jargon of these startup ecosystems. Another element of many research is showing that these high growth ventures also not only so create 200 plus jobs over a certain period of time, but they also are responsible for a big portion of the national GDP. So this is our theory of change, and deconstructed, it looks like, okay, so once we've targeted our high growth ventures, what we know as a very clear output of that is that they need revenue and funding. If they're able to increase revenue and funding, then they're able to hire more, so build job creation and become more profitable, which will then have impact on job creation, but also in terms of, social impact. And in the long term, so we're talking 7-10 years down the line, hopefully we have economic and social development within a nation. On the other side, in order to have that level of scale, what we decided to put in place as kind of the toolkits to support these high growth ventures is that, of course, they need training. There's a huge talent gap, even more so when you start looking into scale up businesses. So ones that are no longer really in this startup dynamic, but that really are starting to be a young organization and need very specific senior competencies that completely lack on many local markets. So training is fundamental. Investment. So concretely, SeedStar, so far we have trained, which means we have spent a certain level of time with entrepreneurs and have been able to measure their growth in terms of revenue, job creation, and other indicators that we're tracking. Until today, 4,000 entrepreneurs. And we also have a capacity to invest in 50 companies since 2018. So now we have more or less a portfolio of 70 companies, and we're raising funds where hopefully we'll be continuing and making 50 investments every year. And then, of course, there's the network of investors that we bring in and that they either co-invest or go in direct within the network of high growth ventures that we identify around the world. For this training investment to work, we, of course, are building a network of mentors, of education institutions and investors really globally around the map. So we have 1,000 active mentors. Active meaning that there really has been a one-on-one matching through our mentor platform with an entrepreneur around the world on a specific skill set. We work with different education institutions across different competencies and sectors of interest, and a network of 3,000 investors, which in this case is mostly business angels, family offices, high net worth, but you also have the more bigger institutionals like the development banks, government development banks, but also the kind of global institutional ones like IFC, which is the venture arm of the World Bank, that are starting to go earlier stage in terms of their equity investments around the globe. To finance this, our model is that we're actually mandated primarily by development banks or nonprofit organizations, government, like local ministries. Right now, we have an expansion program in Colombia to support entrepreneurs from Medellin to expand, or we're working with the telecom in Cambodia to support entrepreneurs in Phnom Penh. So really, there's a diverse set of stakeholders that mandate us to operate these different educational programs on the ground, which allows us to support the beneficiary, which is the entrepreneur. Unfortunately, in education, it's very difficult to find a model in which in emerging markets, you can go direct kind of in a B2C model where you would hope the entrepreneur can afford this education and support. So until today, it's been primarily supported by governments or different public-private partnerships. And really overarching, as I was mentioning a bit before, and which was the reflection of us going into production mode of building this premium content around the hero journey, as we call it, of these entrepreneurs, is because we really feel that we have to build these advocacy activities to showcase what these entrepreneurs are doing. So we have this whole marketing reflection to always showcase the other side of the story of these markets and regions that are very skewed and biased when you look at your local medias in Europe or elsewhere around the world. So I think it's very important, and it's our job to also try and change the story and give more transparency of what are the opportunities, but also the obstacles. Another big element for us in our theory of change, which is, again, more than the economical success of SeedStars, there's also a real reflection of the impact success, and we hope that we will become more of the norm than the exception in how to do business in general. And so for us, in order to support entrepreneurs, we had to be ourselves entrepreneurs. So there was this kind of for us, by us mentality. And so we really bootstrapped. This was how our office looked like in Lagos. And now we opened this great space, and we have now 15 offices, which are these co-working hubs where we reunite kind of all the programs and stakeholders under one roof around the world. We now have over 200 people within the organization. And so this has really been something that has been a constant within how we were able to grow our theory of change, which was by learning from one another. So we have this, what we call in our theory of change, the iterative learning machine, in which basically it's just being in experimentation mode. Every experiment that's put in place within our company is then disseminated within the wider community, and vice versa. So through our programs, we are able to gather a lot of information from our wider network of mentors, ambassadors, but also entrepreneurs that then we use also to fuel the growth of SeedStars, because we ourselves want to continue and be a high growth venture. So really, it's kind of trying to measure all the activities within our group to then link them with what are the intended short-term and mid-term outcomes that we expect in order to talk about an intended impact in the mid-long term. And it sounds scary at first when you jump into this whole theory of change and impact assessment, but the reality, it's just equating what data you want to collect within your organization, at which frequency, and then it really helps you better measure and navigate in terms of how pragmatic you want to be about the impact you want to have with these organizations, and hence the companies and the investees, for example, in our portfolio, also are kind of using these M&E, so monitoring and evaluation frameworks to measure sustainability. And I just wanted to end with this quote because I still find it so true, and yet people kind of pass by it, especially when times are hard right now. But there has been only one thing that holds true in history, which is that it's always started with a small group of people. So if ever you doubted that fact, I think Margaret Mead puts it so well, that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Do you maybe characterize a little bit more on what an emerging market is, what characterizes it, and what made you realize that they were so fundamental to sustainability?
Yes, and this is an ongoing debate, because emerging market, and especially some of the markets we work in, are kind of offended when they're seen in the pool of emerging markets. So it made a lot of sense 8 years ago when we started, because there was these strong classifications where we had kind of the BRIC countries, and then we talked about these emerging market or frontier markets, which at a macro level in terms of population growth, infrastructure, the kind of average income per capita, etc., were becoming very attractive, and that's why we're talking about these emerging market. Today, it's very difficult to classify, because on different fronts, they are more or less emerging. So for us, it's more a reflection of their maturity in terms of the innovation ecosystem, which is the one we're trying to target, which of course is correlated with a subset of socioeconomic elements that the country has or not. But basically, to keep it simple, it's basically everywhere apart from Northern America and Europe.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Directly on that, we have a question saying, besides the obvious difficulties of accessing credit for startup companies in emerging markets, what are the main hurdles that the average entrepreneur will find? Lack of infrastructure, bureaucracy, hiring, etc.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, there are a lot of hurdles which are quite universal to building a business, which is just the sheer momentum of having, that wheel get in place. Sometimes entrepreneurs being too early and the market not being ready, regulatory wise. So there are these kind of general elements that work. In these markets, as I was mentioning before, it's so, there really is a talent gap. And if you want to talk about sustainability, if you bring in talents from around the world, that longevity of the talent to stay locally is much more precarious. And so there really is an issue of local talents on key competencies and sectors, this is why we think education, there's so much to do. There are good signs, the diaspora coming back home, and so that brings in kind of a whole new level of talent pool, but talent is definitely something that lacks. Credibility, but also in-house, in the sense that many times entrepreneurs have had to wait for international investment or certification, as for example being a winner of our competition or one of our programs, to get local exposure through the media, to get suppliers interested in working with them, to have some level of administrative accelerators. So that also, in terms of credibility, is something where it's more difficult for them. And then there's, in a more long-term perspective, the exit strategy, which is also not the same. So there starts to be a secondary market. You can talk about potential IPOs in certain regions. There's more and more an M&A strategy for corporates that want to kind of come into these markets much faster, but it's kind of also equates to the level of maturity of deals that are on the ground. But all the trends are looking really positive over the past years in terms of asset under management allocated in these markets, impact or not, and the success stories that are coming in, which is fueling more talent in the entrepreneurial space.
Okay. Developing on that question that was just asked, it made me think of something you said in a TED talk, where you say that scarcity equals opportunity. And I thought that was something maybe you could just reiterate on here a little bit, and maybe give an example of a business which we could really learn from, you know, in the kind of American, European sphere that we're in. Maybe take an example.
Yes. So already then a big advantage, and I give always this kind of example because it speaks so well, is that because there is not such a big consumer like these old consumer habits, big lobbying groups, heavy and expensive infrastructure, sometimes the capability of a new technology being adopted by the mass goes much faster, because there is that gray zone on the technology, there is no previous habits. And so that's why you see that we skip, and we talk about this leapfrogging technology, which is you skip one technology directly to the next. And it's been proven that nearly systematically that leapfrog always brings you to a more sustainable, cost-efficient, and usually more environmental friendly technology. And so you see that from skipping landlines directly to mobile phones, but that built in a whole industry of the fintech sector. So really everyone is way more comfortable paying with their mobiles and doing a whole lot of transactions in these markets than we are. Then you see that going into all the big spaces, maybe healthcare. I mean, the pandemic currently has allowed many countries to accelerate the pace at which people are now consuming digital healthcare, but it was already something that was, how can I say, that was the only way many citizens have discovered a credible healthcare solution. It started with digital healthcare. Because it was through telemedicine that in rural areas people were able to access much more than just the basic needs. And then and we've seen countless of these businesses that are popping out, and that now we hope are consolidating, so that there can be really a regional and hopefully a global champion. So you see it across all, even in green energy. I mean, it sounds like it's not scalable, the idea that you have these microgrids to be able to fuel electricity for one household, but it's really a game changer also just in economic and societal elevation, because it means that students are going to probably learn more because they have electricity at night to study, or there's going to be a reduction in criminality there. So all these elements really have such an important consequence.
That's incredible. It reminds me of a quote you said in a talk as well, that you're so far behind, you think you are first, which I thought was really powerful.
Yeah.
This, like, we think there's something really new and innovative, and someone else has already been doing it for ages. A very interesting question just came in asking you, once you have seeded into a project like in Argentina, what are the next steps to evaluate them throughout their project? So how do you sort of measure their development? How do you see how they evolve, etc.?
Yeah. So we're still, this theory of change and everything we put in place is quite recent still, because one thing holds true is that you need to be at a certain stage of your life as a business also to have such a intense monitoring and evaluation system, and it's expensive and it's resource intensive. But we've built in programs that should support the entrepreneur from pre-seed to, if possible, expansion, so much later stage. I don't know if it makes sense to talk about series A, B, C, because the numbers are just completely different in these markets. But so we have a capability of supporting them for a long period within their project. That's also for the entrepreneur to see. So it doesn't mean that because we've invested in them, there's an obligation to go through all these programs with us, but that allows us to stay relevant in their story. Until now, it's quite traditional like everyone else. So it's all the surveys that we put in place, and we need to hit a certain conversion so that we have relevant data to work on. But so we keep in touch with the founders to make sure they kind of on indicators that we're tracking to see the evolution of their impact, maybe job creation, ESG related guidelines, and so on. So that's kind of how we're tracking so far. And we're just trying to learn how to have better dynamic data, because it's still quite painful for the people that are being interviewed and for us to make sense out of that data.
I myself had a question I wanted to pose to you, because obviously I'm still at university, and I'm just wondering your take. You know, you've obviously been in a lot of different education spheres, and your role in Seedstars is very much also involved in training and mentorship. So I wonder, what do you think like top institutions are doing right in terms of sustainability and innovation, and spinning the right dialogue about emerging markets, and what do you think needs to change?
Institutions in terms of like educational institutions?
Education institutions like schools and universities.
I don't know, to be honest. I haven't looked into, we work with some, because Babson College has a lot of research around entrepreneurship, and we're always in the reflection of, can you identify a high growth venture before it becomes high growth? So what are those key components? And so we're working with a lot of research institutions and universities. We are reflecting on building a type of, okay, what would the university of tomorrow look like, knowing that the skill set needed is going to be very different. And what we believe is that this skill set is very much linked to the soft and hard skills an entrepreneur needs to have. So we're reflecting a lot of, and we really believe in the peer-to-peer model of education. So there are some schools that are starting to do that. I'm a big fan of, for example, the founding team that did École 42 in Paris with Xavier Niel. So it's this coding school, 100% peer-to-peer learning, and they bring out the elite engineers, but also entrepreneurs. And so that's kind of elements of education where I think we're doing right.
Do you see the emergence on novel public-private platforms addressing key social and climate risks, where Seedstar could play a catalyst role?
Post-crisis, talking about this crisis?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Okay. Tough. So for example, I'm also part of the Innovation Council of the Swiss Confederation, and I think there were some really great schemes put in place to support immediately startups with kind of, or projects that we were initially supporting in understanding that the timeframes would be longer, that the initial fundings would be needed. And I think that's the reactivity was really impressive for Switzerland, which works on consensus, so it can be quite slow. And I've seen other countries do it very well in their schemes of supporting post-crisis. For seed stars, for us, one thing that holds true, but I don't know how much it means working with the public sector. I guess so, because as you saw, we heavily work with them to build this technical assistance, and we continue and push these global institutions and development banks to take the higher risk in investing. So we have these kind of blended finance approach where they're willing to take kind of the first loss or to not have the same return, so that other really more private investors can still bet on similar return on investments with regards to their portfolio allocation. So that level of taking risk where the private sector cannot take the risk today is fundamental. But I still believe the best investment that can be made for the public sector, but private-public partnership, is on education. If I just look at the education system in Europe, there's such a lack of forward thinking in reinventing the way that we are building the next generation of the workforce. And I think there's so much more to be done here, and maybe collaborations with Seed Stars and other organizations that are also willing to experiment very fast on what these types of curriculums could look like.